Thanks for coming out. My name is Bert Patenaude. I'm a research fellow at the Hoover Institution. And Anna, GB, asked me to introduce today's event. We are a couple of months, 3 months away from the 70th anniversary of the Austrian State Treaty. So that's the treaty signed in Vienna in May of 1955 that basically led to the occupation forces withdrawing from Austria, and it led to Austrian neutrality. That was a sort of the main condition of the treaty. Austria would remain neutral, but it gained its independence in 1955. So that treaty is the point of departure for the presentation today. Our guest speaker happens to be an expert on that treaty and on Austria during the Cold War and since. He's going to use that anniversary, this upcoming anniversary, as a point of departure for a talk on the Kremlin's changing views of neutrality in Europe. And the speaker is Wolfgang Mueller. He is a professor of Russian history at the University of Vienna, where he is deputy director of the Institute of East European History. He's also a member of the Austrian Academy of Sciences. He's been a visiting fellow many places, the universities of Nice and Bern. Also, FSI in 2008, 2009. So we're sort of welcoming Wolfgang back to campus. Also has been a visiting fellow at the Russian Academy of Sciences. His books and articles are many. I'll just mention the titles of two books because they relate to today's talk. In 2005, he published a book, and I'm translating from the German, The Soviet Occupation in Austria, 1945, 1955. And then in 2011, a book under the title, A Good Example of Peaceful Coexistence, The Soviet Union, Austria, and Neutrality. Professor Mueller, you're welcome.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear Bert, thank you so much for having me. It's a great honor to be back here to Stanford. And let me start by thanking the organizers, Professor Patenaude, also Professor Jamala Bousse and Professor Kotkin, thanking Stanford University and the Hoover Institution also for sponsoring my stay here. It's great to be back, and we are gathering here at a truly historic moment. And what I have in mind is not so much any anniversary of the Austrian State Treaty or declaration of neutrality, which happened some months later, but with regard to President Donald Trump ushering in a new phase or a new attempt in ending or stopping the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine. As all of you certainly know, the issue of neutrality or neutralization has been part of many schemes and ideas that have been leaked with regards to any future settlement for Ukraine. And in fact, neutrality or neutralization of Ukraine has been a long-standing Russian demand. This very often makes us overlook the fact that Ukraine, in fact, was a neutral or non-aligned state when it was first attacked by Russia in 2014. Non-alignment had been part of the Ukrainian process of independence, and despite being questioned under the Yushchenko presidency, there was legislation adopted in Ukraine before 2014 for making Ukraine a neutral state. In fact, the Russian attack on Ukraine was possible because it was no member of a military alliance. One might even say because it was neutral or non-aligned. So neutrality has very specific consequences very often for the neutral, for the neutralized. These are two different terms. Usually we are using the term of neutral or neutrality if it is self-chosen, while neutralization is something that is being imposed against, more or less against the will. But the Austrian case already shows us that there is no clear-cut difference between either choosing it out of free will or having it imposed upon a country. Since in the Austrian case, neutrality was, as Professor Patenaude already said, the price for the Soviet consent with withdrawing from Austria in 1955. So it's very hard to say whether it was chosen at free will or it was imposed on Austria. In fact, the legal construction here is quite clear. This is an Austrian matter. This was adopted by the Austrian parliament at free will. And this was deliberately chosen in order not to have foreign powers having a say in the implementation of Austrian neutrality. One of the consequences of neutrality is that very often a neutral is weaker than a non-neutral state. More often than not, neutrality, despite having been adopted by great powers also in the past, think about the United States or think about the Russian Empire, for instance, in the 18th century at certain times, that in the more recent past, it has been chosen by small states in Europe. We are talking here about a specific model that is different from, for instance, third world non-alignment as it was chosen by India and by other states. So it has been adopted, neutrality, more often than not by smaller states in Europe. And very often it was the consequence of some sort of defeat or of the necessity to find a new security strategy. But it has the consequences that neutrality also weakens the neutral. As it is no part of a larger alliance, it has no ally to back the neutral up. And that's why it's certainly a weakening factor. And that's also why among the reasons why, for instance, as a consequence of the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine, two long-time neutrals, Finland and Sweden, abandoned neutrality in 2022 and chose to become members of the North Atlantic Alliance. But how does the current situation, the Russian war against Ukraine in particular, affect the neutrality of other European nations, and how is this perceived by the Kremlin? How does the current Russian attitude toward neutrality either dovetail with Soviet attitudes toward neutrality or deviate from it? These are some of the questions that I will address in the following 30 minutes. In my talk, I will start with the current situation, then move back into the Cold War and look into the Soviet attitude toward neutrality, and then finally draw some conclusions. With regard to the current situation, let us start with the general observation that the Scandinavian, the Finnish and Swedish reaction of giving up neutrality was far from being universal among European neutrals. Despite some debate and the general commitment toward increased defense spending, for instance, Irish elites remained reluctant about questioning their country's neutral status. And the Austrian chancellor, back then in 2022, who was fighting an uphill battle against the radical right-wing Freedom Party, explicitly ruled out a political debate about neutrality at all, fearing that neutrality-loving Austrians would punish those who were questioning their country's neutral status in the upcoming parliamentary elections. Although Austrian neutrality, which was adopted in 1955, as we have already heard, as the price for the Soviet withdrawal from the country after World War II, is relatively young, it is also highly popular, with its approval ratings usually over 80%, thereby exceeding Irish approval ratings for Irish neutrality by some 20 points. While Irish and Austrian policy are by and large predetermined by the EU common foreign and security policy, which is also inscribed into the Austrian constitution and usually trumps neutrality, this is not the case with Switzerland. Although, after some hesitation, the Swiss Confederation also joined EU sanctions against Russia, albeit with some loopholes included. The Swiss also agreed to return some tanks to Germany, but when it came to sending ammunition to Ukraine, which was desperately needed in 2022, however, the Swiss stalled. In addition, an initiative was launched to inscribe neutrality, whose popularity is usually around 90% into Switzerland's constitution. At the same time, however, advocacy for NATO membership increased to 31% in Switzerland. As contradictory this may seem, slightly more than 50% of the population agreed that Switzerland should have close ties to NATO. While none of these debates in Ireland, Austria, or Switzerland are anywhere close to producing an effect that may have an influence on the strategic balance in Europe, the changes in the hitherto neutral north, so in Scandinavia, bordering Russia's northwestern flank, are likely to be significant. Here we see the meeting of the Finnish and Swedish foreign ministers with then NATO Secretary General. And we also see how quickly the approval for NATO membership increased in both countries in response to the Russian aggression against Ukraine. Among the security and military consequences of Finnish and Swedish NATO membership are the creation and deployment of additional defense, deterrence, and counterstrike capabilities such as airfields and missiles. As Al Jazeera reported, and I quote, Finland's membership in NATO particularly leaves Murmansk, the naval basis of the Russian Northern Fleet in the Barents Sea and possibly also in the White Sea, vulnerable, end quote. Since all of this was more or less foreseeable as possible side effect of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it calls even more into question the widespread thesis that this Russian aggression had anything to do with Russian concern over a much less likely NATO accession by Ukraine. The Russian reaction to the Finnish and Swedish decisions to join NATO was negative but muted, as two commentators in the Texas National Security Review put it. Then Finnish President Sauli Niinistö, an extremely experienced leader who was decisive in the political process and who skillfully managed the communication, also vis-à-vis his Russian counterpart, recalled Vladimir Putin's warning, and I quote, Vladimir Putin saying, "When we look across the border now, we see a Finn on the other side. If Finland joins NATO, we will see an enemy," end quote. While Russian resources are currently obviously concentrated on the war against Ukraine and appear to be overstretched in any case, Putin's announcement of the creation of the Leningrad military district and the concentration of forces there points to military countermeasures against the NATO accession of Finland and Sweden. This is not to say that neutral Finland or Sweden would have been exempt from Russian covert activities, as the Austrian example shows today. In the end, both NATO members, as well as neutral Austria, became targets of hybrid assaults, such as the disruption of undersea cables, the blowing up of railroads, and the political channeling of migrants to European borders, in the cases of Sweden and Finland, or the relatively limited, however existent,
cyber attacks on the eve of last year's Austrian general elections. What seems more surprising are the rather disparaging assessment of Austrian and Swiss policy by Russian officials. This disapproval was made clear by Maria Zakharova, the foreign ministry's spokesperson, when she criticized that both countries had given up neutrality in the current war. I quote, "We regret that literally before our eyes in recent years, such countries as Austria and Switzerland have forgotten the glorious traditions of neutrality in favor of unobvious and misunderstood short-term interests in the context of the Ukrainian crisis. They have thrown away the chance to act as mediators in the search for solutions to the pressing challenges of our time." At the same time, she claimed that Russia had, I quote again, "great respect for the policy of genuine neutrality." Looking at such current Russian statements more closely, they seem to be surprisingly consistent with Soviet Cold War rhetoric. This brings us to the second part of my talk. How did the post-war USSR come up with neutrality, and how did it try to promote it, and for what reason? To be sure, the USSR had already promoted and signed neutrality agreements since the 1920s with some of its neighboring states in an effort to increase Soviet security by neutralizing its immediate surroundings. After World War II, however, this idea developed into something more grandiose. Soon after the founding of NATO, 1949, and in the context of the Soviet struggle against the emergence of the European defense community, which was not created in the end, but in the Soviet struggle against it, neutrality started to be promoted by the Kremlin and the Communist parties as a tool for preventing Western states from joining the blocs. Here again, we have to keep in mind, neutralizing other states means weakening them. And if this applies to potential Western allies, then it also means weakening the Western alliance because it's deprived of potential further members. This campaign reached its peak with Stalin's proposal of 1952, which offered the reunification of Germany at the price of the country's neutralization. It's highly debatable whether this proposal was sincere. I mean, it has been a 50 years debate among historians, as some of you may know, but today the large majority thinks that this offer was poor propaganda. However, soon after taking supreme power in the Kremlin in 1955, Nikita Khrushchev, Stalin's successor, decided to put the strategy of neutralizing Western states to the test by promoting Austria's permanent neutrality as the price for withdrawing from that country. This was agreed in bilateral Austrian-Soviet negotiations in April 1955. Then in May, the State Treaty was signed in Vienna by the four powers, by the US, UK, France, Soviet Union, plus Austria, and in October, the Austrian law on neutrality was adopted. From this point until the mid-1960s, the Soviet strategy regarding neutrality consisted of two elements. Element number one was the promotion of permanent neutrality among Western nations. Neutralizing Austria was only the first step in a major campaign for spreading neutrality in the West and undermining the Western alliance. In this campaign, the Austrian example was generously used by the Soviet side with the aim of convincing other Western states of the benefits of neutrality. This was reflected in praise for the Swiss neutrality also and for Sweden's neutral policy, as well as in the recognition of Finnish neutrality, which had hitherto not been recognized. Scandinavia, with its delicate Nordic balance between NATO members, here in blue, Iceland, Denmark, and Norway, the latter two without foreign bases on their soil. Then neutral Sweden in gray, and the special case of Finland, also in gray, was chosen to be another showcase of the potential that was presented in the relations between the USSR and the neutrals. When the Norwegian, Danish, and Swedish prime ministers visited Moscow in the 1950s, they were given the suggestion of making their countries, two of them, as we already saw, NATO members, a neutral zone. Iceland was offered the Soviet guarantee of security if it chose to expel US bases and declare itself neutral. Although the NATO members remained integrated into the alliance, the USSR had more leverage on the situation in Scandinavia if it did not force Finland into a closer alliance, as such a step might have provoked Sweden to apply for NATO membership already then, and Norway to invite US soldiers onto its soil. In the 1950s, the Soviet Union also promoted the adoption of neutrality by West Germany, Italy, Greece, Turkey, and Japan. During the Berlin crisis, Khrushchev suggested neutralizing the western part of that city and replacing the western garrison with armed forces from neutral country, thus aiming at weakening West Berlin's defense and flattering the self-esteem of the neutrals. Here we see Nikita Khrushchev with then Austrian Chancellor Julius Raab. He is obviously handing over as a present. That's a model of Sputnik. He was very, very talented in such propaganda gestures. So he was handing over these tiny Sputnik models to all Western visitors or people whom he visited. This brings me to the second main goal of the Soviet neutralization strategy, and that was to shape the Western understanding of permanent neutrality, of the obligations, of the duties and obligations and rights of permanent neutrals, according to Soviet wishes. In Soviet eyes, neutrality was more progressive than capitalism, but less progressive than socialism. By means of ever closer political, economic, and cultural cooperation with the West, neutrals, remember, we have said the neutral is weaker usually than non-neutrals. So neutrals were expected to gravitate towards the Soviet Union. For a socialist state, however, permanent neutrality was not deemed a fit condition. With regard to the rights and duties of permanent neutrals in peacetime, Soviet lawyers took on the task of formulating a set of rules that reflected the Soviet interest in turning neutral states into partners or tools of Soviet policy. In general, the Soviet theory called upon neutrals to establish friendly relations with all other countries. This sounds very unspectacular, but the consequences are, for instance, that Soviet lawyers claimed that neutrals had to, for instance, recognize countries that were not universally recognized back then, such as the GDR, East Germany, or even the People's Republic of China. Neutrals were also called upon to maintain economic equidistance between the two blocs in the Cold War, and not to participate in economic sanctions or boycotts, which were usually used by the West against the Soviet bloc again. Moreover, neutrals were repeatedly pressed by Soviet diplomacy to condemn, for instance, US intervention in the Vietnam War, or in general, the stationing of US troops in foreign countries. The questions of whether neutrals were allowed or had to defend themselves in the case of war was not unanimously answered by Soviet scholars. When Switzerland and Sweden in the 1950s and early 60s considered introducing a program for nuclear defense, both countries were fiercely attacked by Soviet propaganda. If a neutral country lived up to Soviet expectation, it was highly praised by the Soviet side and rewarded. If the Soviet side wished to persuade a neutral to take certain steps, the neutral was told that neutrality would oblige the neutral to do something that the Soviet Union wanted. If the neutral, however, did not fulfill Soviet expectations, it was criticized for not living up to its obligations as a neutral. Undesired actions by neutral states were branded as being at odds with neutrality. Therefore, it was stated that neutrality did not allow neutral countries to do what the USSR did not want them to do. The Soviet campaign for neutrality reached its apex in the 1960s, and most likely due to the dangerous attraction neutrality might have had on Central European countries in the Eastern Bloc, such as Hungary and Czechoslovakia. It was later downgraded under Leonid Brezhnev after the Soviet invasion in Czechoslovakia in 1968. The Soviet invasion in Hungary 12 years earlier, and also the one in Czechoslovakia, demonstrated that neutrality did not automatically mean territorial inviolability from the Soviet perspective. The Soviet Air Force repeatedly violated the Austrian airspace, as it had already done during the Soviet crackdown on the Hungarian uprising in '56. Another neutral victim of Soviet intrusions, albeit naval ones, was Sweden in the 1980s. The end of the Cold War and the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact at the USSR significantly reduced international tension, but also attention for Western permanent neutrality. Sweden, Finland, and Austria joined the European Union in 1995. Ireland had already done so in '73 without provoking significant Soviet or Russian countermeasures. In many of these countries, and even in Switzerland, debates occurred at some point whether neutrality was still an appropriate strategy. While analysts often concluded that alliance membership would better contribute to national security, they also found out that neutrality was highly popular among the population of neutral states for reasons of nostalgia, ideology, or identity. In Austria, for example, the grand coalition between Social Democrats and Conservatives in the 1990s therefore could not agree on a new national security strategy. This did not question the joint commitment to Austria's participation in the EU security and defense policy, despite neutrality. Since then, the Constitution has allowed for all measures of European security and defense policy, even if they contradict classical wartime neutrality. The only exceptions are alliance membership and the stationing of foreign troops on Austrian soil. These are the things that are still prohibited according to the Austrian neutrality law. In the end, none of the Western permanent neutrals decided to join NATO before the Russian large-scale invasion. And the years before, the new members of the Western Alliance, as you see here on the map, had come from Central and Southeastern Europe. Yet, despite most Central European states joining NATO in the end, permanent neutrality and non-alignment did not disappear entirely, as for instance, as I mentioned before, Ukraine or Belarus joined the group of non-aligned countries. From the Russian perspective, no specific strategy of promoting neutrality in Europe was discernible until the large-scale invasion of '22. When, for instance, in 2018, Austria's pro-Russian right-wing foreign minister Karin Kneißl proposed an Austrian mediation in the war in Syria at a press conference, she was rebuffed by her Russian colleague Sergei Lavrov. Similarly, the trip of Austrian Chancellor Karl Nehammer, the shuttle diplomacy, if you wish, to Kyiv and Moscow in April 2022, so very soon after the war started, remained without success, and Austrian offers for mediation, for neutral mediation, were not accepted. Ukraine was the most obvious case of neutrality being proposed, if not outright demanded, by Russia at this time. As we have already heard, non-alignment had been included in various declarations and laws of independent Ukraine, and it was by and large observed. It was abandoned in 2014, only after the Russian aggression had started. Today's Russian war against Ukraine is reminiscent of Soviet policies, or Stalinist policies, one should say, toward Finland, in that they also combined a war of aggression, Russian annexations, and the neutralization of a neighboring country. Russian aggression against Ukraine since 2014 has provoked various reactions. While Ukraine gave up non-alignment in December 2014 and Sweden and Finland in 2022, surveys in Switzerland and Austria showed that majorities of more than 70% in each country considered national security to be best protected still by neutrality, a claim that has been repeatedly falsified in history, most recently in Ukraine, but also when we go back, for instance, to the example of Belgium in both world wars. In the case of Central European, the new Central European NATO members, such as Slovakia, Hungary, and Romania, Russian media warfare has contributed to significantly strengthening neutralist tendencies, as I have demonstrated in my talk at Hoover Institution on Monday. In contrast to opinion polls in Scandinavia, which usually point to a high level of support for the Ukrainian cause, including Western arms deliveries and also for Western sanctions. We see, for instance, here, these are opinion polls, agreement in green and opposite side in red with regards to Western arms deliveries. And here we see the highest figures, the highest numbers here in Scandinavia, in Sweden and Finland, the youngest NATO members, here 69% absolutely, plus 23% more or less support Western military supply being sent to Ukraine. Then we have Finland, Denmark, Netherlands, Poland, and then the Baltics. Here the red arrow is Austria. It's in the middle, and then we see the Central European, more recent or younger NATO members, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, but also older ones like Greece. And they usually point to the fact that people in these countries, in their majority, are speaking out against Western arms deliveries and also Western sanctions against Russia. As other polls repeatedly show, many Europeans still have high expectations regarding the ability of neutral states to bring peace to the world and to prevent wars. Such hopes have proven unfounded. Still, they were and are nourished by Russian diplomacy, as most recently, again, the foreign ministry spokesperson that I have already quoted on Switzerland and Sweden. I continue the quote. Zakharova said, "Neutral nations have a great opportunity to act as mediators in conflict resolution, assist with peacemaking and confidence building, and with the consent of the conflicting sides." We have seen that this consent, at least from the Russian side, was or did not come forward with regard to two specific Austrian offers. So what conclusions can be drawn from the development of neutrality in Europe in general and the Soviet or Russian attitude toward it in particular? During the Cold War, Soviet policy used the promotion and shaping of neutrality to undermine the West, to weaken states and the Western alliance, and to make neutrals more susceptible to Soviet wishes. This strategy was applied with different intensity, mostly from the 1950s until 1968, less so in the 1970s and after Perestroika. After having lost interest in neutrality among Western countries in the 1990s, Russian diplomacy seems to have rediscovered it. Maria Zakharova's statements sounds sound reminiscent of similar Soviet declarations from the 1950s and 60s that promoted neutrality and disarmament in the West, while criticizing Western neutrals if they did not behave in the way the Kremlin expected. Today, Russian allusions to true neutrality can be understood as one among many tools for undermining a coordinated Western response to the challenges posed by the Russian invasion of Ukraine and hybrid warfare against the West. Other similarities between the situation today and the situation in the Cold War, for instance, relate to the fact that whenever East-West tension increases, the integration of the Western Bloc also increases. Moreover, neutralist attitudes are being spread not only among small and neutral countries, but also among members of the Western Alliance. What has significantly changed since the 1960s, however, is the security environment, in particular with regard to European integration, which has allowed and continues to allow small countries like Finland and Sweden to make their own security choices, or at least to stand their ground better than if they were relying on their own resources only. What does this mean for the Russian war against Ukraine and for a possible settlement? We have spoken about the fact that neutralization of Ukraine is a long-standing Russian demand. And we've also spoken about the fact that neutralizing a country also more often than not makes it weaker than when it is not neutralized. So any Ukrainian solution without a strong security guarantee for this country will result in a weakening not only of Ukraine, but also of Europe and the West in general, and may have the most serious consequences for the future to come. I thank you for your attention.
Okay, we have plenty of time for questions. Maybe I'll start us off with one. To what extent, and I don't know how much we know about this, was the Kremlin taken off guard by Finland, Sweden joining NATO?
These discussions that I have referred to, and also the conversations between the Finnish president and Putin, they had already taken place in the previous years. So since 2014, there must have been some awareness on the Russian side that this was a possibility among experts. This was foreseen that this would happen after a large-scale invasion. So since 21, it was very much expected that this would happen, particularly with regard to Finland, less so with regard to Sweden. And also we have to take into account that the outcome, ratification process and all that still was unclear, and it was not that smooth as at least in the Swedish case, as one may have expected.
Okay, questions for our speaker? Yes, Christoph.
Yeah, I have two questions. Just questions to hear your thoughts on two things. So, I mean, as you know, the EU treaties also have a self-defense clause. So my first question is whether you could say something about how that fits in with Austrian neutrality, or the other way around, how Austrian neutrality fits in with that. And then second, the current government negotiations in Austria to form an FPÖ-led government. Do you expect that to have any impact on Austrian neutrality or its policy toward it?
With regard to the first question, you will certainly know that in the respective clause of the EU treaty for mutual support defense, there is a clause, the so-called Irish clause, that qualifies this obligation. And in fact, that's not so exceptional, because when we look at, for instance, the NATO treaty, it also says that it's up to each NATO member state to decide what sort of support it will lend to any country that's being attacked. So these are more or less similar formulations. Perhaps in the EU treaty, it's made more explicit that this will take into account the specific national traditions and policies being implemented by EU members in the field of security policy. Whether a future Ukrainian membership may serve as a surrogate for NATO membership, this is something that we cannot assess right now, because first of all, the EU accession process is far more complicated, as most of you will know, and it also takes much longer. And then also we still don't know whether this is going to happen. However, that may be one loophole or one solution now, since the new US administration has explicitly ruled out a NATO membership for Ukraine for the near future, at least. I mean, you are aware of the fact that there are a growing number of statements also by the newly appointed Secretary of Defense most recently, where he said that he does not believe that NATO membership is in the cards for Ukraine anytime soon. And then also we have to wait and see what NATO membership will mean after this second Trump administration. So what it's going to mean. Yeah, with the second question. Yeah. Well, this is already more or less historic question, as these negotiations were discontinued. So FPÖ leader gave back the mandate for forming a government. What can be said, however, is that certainly the FPÖ has made itself an advocate of a ultra-neutralist interpretation of neutrality, although with a Russian-friendly tilt, one might say. So after having advocated NATO membership for some time in the Cold War, then after Austria joining the EU, and in fact only in the new millennium, so only in the 2000s, it has become an advocate of this ultra-neutralist neutrality, saying that Austria should neither support Ukraine nor support Russia, and this, however, with lots of sympathies for the Kremlin, and also with a cooperation agreement that had been signed in 2016 between the FPÖ and United Russia Party. Whether this will affect Austrian foreign policy in the coming years now will depend upon perhaps a new round of coalition negotiations. We don't know yet what will happen, whether there will be a cabinet of expert and non-political cabinet appointed by the Austrian president, which would be possible. And the leader of the Social Democratic Party already said that the Social Democrats, who finished third in the most recent elections, that they would support such a non-political cabinet. But we don't know what the president is going to do, or whether he's going to give the mandate perhaps even to the Social Democrats, who haven't had it yet. So that also would be an option.
Yes, thank you very much for your very interesting speech. You highlighted that the neutral state has to maintain equidistance between both parts. So I was wondering, considering the fact that Austria has joined the Marshall Plan already before the State Treaty, later on the Council of Europe in 1958, European Free Trade Association in '60, and then European Union. So it was never equidistance. Was Austria ever a neutral state in the strict sense?
From the Soviet perspective, not. No. And there is also plenty of great quotes by Nikita Khrushchev saying in the end, well, these neutrals, they claim on being neutral, but they hate us. They don't like us. I mean, he was this kind of person who would speak his mind, and that was certainly his perception. But we have this argument in Soviet legal literature, and something that has not well definitely established through research is then how this was connected to the Soviet government and to the Soviet apparatus. So how these formerly independent scholars, how they were taken into the information loop of Soviet diplomacy, of the Soviet party apparatus, and then also how this was coordinated in promoting this to the international sphere. We know that there were plenty of international organizations, also of lawyers. You know this much better than I do. And in the Cold War, for instance, the International Association of Democratic Lawyers, which had many members from the Soviet bloc countries, was adopting resolutions, for instance, calling upon the United Nations for formalizing the rights and duties of permanent neutral states. And in these initiatives, for instance, economic equidistance would be included. But from the Soviet perspective, or from Khrushchev's perspective, and the perspective of some Soviet lawyers, it certainly never was.
What is the link between neutrality and demilitarization, or at least some limitation on offensive military capabilities? For example, President Zelensky has said, you know, we made a mistake giving up our nuclear weapons and reliance upon becoming neutral. If a country like Ukraine or Austria, for example, were to be neutral, does that imply that they would forego having nuclear weapons? Would it imply that they would forego having any offensive military capabilities hitting, for example, for hitting Moscow, etc.?
Yeah, thank you. That's a fantastic question, because I did not talk so much about this, and that's a crucial point. Looking at classic traditional Western neutrality, then it usually claims that the neutral has to be able to defend its territory. That's one of the core points, core demands. In order to be neutral, you have to be able to defend, to deny the use of your territory to any of the belligerents. Otherwise, it's impossible to uphold neutrality. However, from the Soviet perspective, as I have briefly mentioned, this was questioned to a large extent. And the Swedish, for instance, were often criticized for having too large an army. And when you look at the negotiations, for instance, between the Soviets and the Austrians, who were desperately asking for more weapons, then it also turned out that the Soviets did not want Austria to have a strong army. And this is also something that's relating to the current situation. We see that, or how, in the Russian list of demands, we have together neutralization and demilitarization. From the Western understanding, these are things that are contradicting one another utterly. There could be no stronger contradiction than between neutralization and demilitarization. That's another thing that we should also keep in mind. Neutralization in the classical Western understanding is, or neutrality as a means for safeguarding, for upholding territorial integrity. As Professor Patenaude mentioned, and I also briefly spoke about it, this was neutrality. Austrian neutrality was a price for the Allied forces, so the World War II allies, so the four powers and the Soviets, to leave the country in order to reinstate its full sovereignty and also to uphold its territorial integrity. Now, when we see, again, look to Russia and Ukraine, we see another contradiction. We have the occupation and annexation of large parts of Ukrainian territory. And at the same time, also the neutralization. So what sense does it make to agree to become neutral if already 10% of your territory has been occupied and annexed by someone else? So I think we have also to keep this in mind.
I think it's linked to another trend that has discredited neutrality, which is the emergence of hybrid or covert warfare. If I'm Zelensky, I might say, well, considering neutrality, perhaps, but there's no way I'm disarming and having a bunch of little green men come into the country and undermine it. So, there are two different concepts there.
Exactly, and that would be back to the situation of 2014.
Right.
In fact, having no strong army and being neutral. That was what the situation of Ukraine was in spring of 2014. And I mean, here also the devil is going to be in the detail. Think about how armistice and the next steps are going to affect combat readiness. If Ukraine has to demobilize, its army is going to shrink to what? 25% of the current status? Yeah. How could it then be that it may be able to defend itself in the future? So these are exactly the problematic, highly problematic and dangerous points.
Questions? Yes. Sir. What would you think about a proposition that neutrality is at best a comfort blanket for the 9 million Austrians, 9 million Swiss, and 5 million Irish, and nothing more than that? It really is sort of dead as a concept in connection with the invasion that's taken place of Ukraine by Russia, but more importantly, with the transactional nature of NATO membership as evinced by Trump, that if you're not spending 2% or more of your GDP, 2.5, getting up to 3% of GDP, then he doesn't give a damn what happens to you. With Austria spending 0.9, 0.8% of its GDP on defense, I mean, the Irish spend 0.2% of GDP on defense. Can you really say that Austria as a state is fulfilling its obligations to provide protection in the context of Russian aggression, a Trump transactional nature to collective security, and what it really would cost to defend a state?
The short answer is no. Austria certainly does not, and it never did. I mean, perhaps the more interesting question is why is this the case, and why was it never able to develop a philosophy as it used to be in Switzerland? Obviously, the geographic situation of Austria is more difficult than the Swiss one, but also there was from most governments in power after 1955, you wouldn't see that there was such a strong commitment. Now, the more complicated question is, what would it take to do? And well, also in the aftermath or in response to the Zeitenwende announcement in Germany, also legislation has been approved in Austria to increase defense spending. However, this is still very far from where it would be necessary to be, not only in order to defend the country itself, which is not possible at the moment, and perhaps also will never fully be without being part of a larger alliance, but also in order to contribute to collective security. And here there is a long, long way to go, not only with regard to purchasing hardware, putting money there, but also, as I mentioned before, with regard to creating awareness. There is no awareness at all. And that's something that is still, yeah, needs to be done in the future.
We have time for another question. And I get to ask it. I'm so curious. So the state treaty, May 1955, was there a debate in the Kremlin or regrets later on? Was there ever any doubt that they should have done this because it maybe didn't lead to in the direction they thought? I mean, 56 is a big year, right? So
certainly, we don't see it. No. The Austrian state treaty is insofar it's not only for Austrians interesting, but also from the perspective of Soviet foreign policy, because it's actually the first policy that's designed and implemented by Nikita Khrushchev of taking power. That's exactly what's happening while he is pushing away the old guard, while he is pushing Molotov onto the back seat. And he was very, well, it was very important for him to have this succeed, because it was perhaps his first coming out as someone who was taking charge of foreign policy as well, not only with regard to internal things, but also foreign policy. That's and well, we haven't seen the doubts. I mentioned some statements that he said, well, the neutrals, they are not really neutral, but still he tried to make them as neutral as possible. Economically, it was a good deal for the USSR. The Austrians paid much more than even the Soviets had wanted them. So that was a bargain. Austria had to buy, or it didn't have to, but they bought back the oil wells. So Austria was an oil producer, crude oil producer, second largest in Europe at this time. But first, the oil went into the Nazi German war effort, and then it went to the USSR. And then when the deliveries ended, then it was gone, basically. So that's the situation, and Austria paid much more than the Soviets wanted them. And Khrushchev, until the end of his time, he used to repeat that he liked this package, neutrality, state treaty, that he liked Austrians, that he wanted Austrians to promote neutrality, also to convince other Western European countries. That's, for instance, in the context of deployment of nuclear missiles in the late 1950s in Western Europe, when he basically takes the Austrian hostage and says, well, you Austrians, if there are US missiles that had been launched from Italy, and they cross the Austrian airspace, then you are responsible too. So you have to go to Italy, and you have to convince them to do away with these US missiles. So he was really trying to instrumentalize this, and so he liked this solution.
Okay, well, this is a context of European development that most of us don't really think about, certainly not the Ukraine war in this context of neutrality. So thank you for this presentation, very illuminating. Thank you, Professor Mueller.